I saw him across the crowded ballroom, and for a split second, I didn't recognize him. Brandon Muller, my ex from college. The one who swore I'd never find anyone better, that I'd come crawling back to him within 5 years. He was standing near the bar in a tailored navy suit, nursing a martini, his hair perfectly styled the way he always kept it. He looked exactly the same, confident, smug, like the world owed him something. And then he saw me. I watched his face light up like he'd just won the lottery. He thought this was his moment. He thought I'd spent the last 15 years pining for him. What he didn't see yet was the man who had just excused himself from our conversation across the room. What he didn't know was that I'd spent the last decade and a half building a life that made my old existence look like a practice run. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started. Not at the reunion, but years before, when I was still the woman Brandon thought he owned. My name is Jennifer. I'm 42 now, and I live in a 4-bedroom colonial in the Westchester suburbs with my husband Michael, our 2 kids, and honestly, a life I used to only dream about. But this story isn't really about where I ended up. It's about the man I almost spent my whole life with, and the man I actually chose, and the moment everything came full circle in the most unexpected way possible. Let me take you back 15 years. I was 27, living in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment in Manhattan, with threadbare furniture and dreams bigger than my bank account. I was working as an assistant at a mid-level marketing firm, making $38,000 a year before taxes, eating ramen on Thursdays because that's when my paycheck ran lowest. Brandon and I had been dating for 3 years. He worked in finance, made good money, around $150 a year, and he never let me forget it. He'd pay for dinners, sure, but he'd always mention how much they cost. He'd pick up my rent sometimes, then reference it casually in arguments. "After everything I've done for you, Jennifer." That was his favorite line. I loved him, or I thought I did. Looking back, I think I loved the idea of him, the security, the sense that someone successful wanted to be with me. My mother loved him. She'd call me up and say, "Brandon's such a catch, Jenny. Don't screw this up." My best friend Ashley kept her mouth shut, but I could see it in her eyes. She didn't trust him. She'd warned me early on that he had a wandering eye, but I didn't listen. I was too busy trying to convince myself that this was what adult love looked like. Brandon wanted to get married. He proposed one December at some overpriced restaurant in Tribeca, got down on one knee, ordered a 2-carat diamond that he made very sure I knew had cost him $8,000. I said yes. How could I not? This was supposed to be it. This was supposed to be my life secured. The engagement lasted 8 months. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was a photo, Brandon with another woman, both of them laughing at some outdoor cafe. The message read, "I thought you should know who you're marrying." My hands shook so badly I could barely hold my phone. I didn't even confront him that day. I just sat at my desk at work, staring at that image, trying to convince myself it was fake, that someone had photoshopped it, that there was some explanation that would make sense. That evening, I asked him about it. I remember exactly where we were, standing in our kitchen, me with my back against the refrigerator, him by the sink with a glass of water in his hand. "Brandon, who is that woman?" He didn't even look confused. He just sighed like I'd asked him something tedious. "Her name is Jessica. She's a colleague." "A colleague," I repeated. "We've been working on a project together. We had lunch." "You're holding hands in that photo." He finally turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never noticed before. Or maybe I just hadn't wanted to see it. He looked at me like I was being unreasonable, like my hurt feelings were an inconvenience. "Nothing happened, Jennifer." But something had. I just didn't know how much yet. I didn't confront him again that week. I just moved through our apartment like a ghost, sleeping on the couch, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. He didn't even try to fix it. That should have told me everything I needed to know. On Friday, I called my mother. I don't know why. I think I needed someone to tell me I was overreacting, that this was all some misunderstanding. Instead, she said, Well, Jennifer, what did you expect? He's a man. Men do these things. That's when I realized I was completely alone in this. My own mother had just told me that infidelity was something I should have anticipated, like a natural disaster or a tax audit. I called Ashley at work. She came over that night with a bottle of wine, and her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. I told you about him, she said quietly, sitting on the couch while I stared at nothing. I told you from the beginning. I know you did. And you didn't listen because you wanted the security. You wanted the guy with the good job and the apartment he could afford, and the validation of being chosen by someone successful. I couldn't argue with her. She was right, and that was almost worse than Brandon's betrayal. The betrayal I could blame on him. My own choices. Those were mine to carry. The engagement ended the next week. I gave him back the ring. He tried to convince me it was nothing, that Jessica meant nothing, that I was being unreasonable and dramatic. This is what happens when you don't have enough going on in your own life, he said. You obsess over things that don't matter, as if my hurt feelings were a personal failing on my part. I took the next year to rebuild. I got a raise at work, $45,000. I moved into a smaller apartment I could afford on my own salary, in a less trendy neighborhood in Queens. Ashley helped me move. We didn't talk about Brandon. We just loaded boxes and listened to music and pretended that part of my life had never happened. But the damage was deeper than I realized. I became hyper-vigilant about relationships. When I dated, I was constantly scanning for signs of deception. I checked phones. I showed up unannounced. I drove myself and at least two perfectly decent men absolutely insane with my paranoia. By the time I was 30, I'd convinced myself that I was broken, that I'd never be able to trust anyone, that maybe my mother was right. Maybe this was just what life looked like for women like me. Then Michael walked into my life on a Tuesday in March. He wasn't flashy. He was a structural engineer, quiet, the kind of man who listened more than he talked. We met at a friend's birthday party, mutual friend, not Ashley, someone I'd met through work. He spent most of the evening talking to me about his job, asking genuine questions about my work in marketing, actually remembering my answers when he followed up with another question. By the end of the night, I realized I'd done almost all the talking, and he still seemed interested. He asked for my number. I almost didn't give it to him. I almost said, "You seem nice, but I'm damaged goods, and I'm going to make your life hell with my trust issues." Instead, I gave him my number, and he called me the next day. Our first date was dinner at a mid-range Italian place in Manhattan, somewhere nice, but not ostentatious. He didn't mention how much the meal cost. He didn't order the most expensive wine to show off. He asked me about my childhood, my dreams, my fears. And when I told him about Brandon, which I did on that first date because I needed to know if he could handle it, he didn't minimize my pain or blame me. He just listened. When I finished, he said, "That sounds really hard. I'm sorry you went through that. No lectures. No, you should have known better. Just empathy." We dated for 3 years before he proposed. He didn't get down on one knee in a restaurant. He did it at home, in our kitchen, on a random Sunday morning, while I was making coffee in an old t-shirt with a hole in the sleeve. He had a simple platinum band, 1 carat, nothing like Brandon's flashy stone. When I asked him why he'd chosen something so modest, he said, "Because it's beautiful, and because the ring isn't what matters." I wanted to spend money on our life together, not on proving something to people at a party. We got married at City Hall. No big wedding, no drama. Just our closest friends and family, a judge, and a sense that we were building something real instead of performing something for an audience. Michael made $75,000 a year back then. Not wealthy, but stable. More importantly, he was honest. He told me how much he made, how much he had in savings, what his student loans looked like. No secrets, no games. We had our first child, Emma, 2 years after we got married. Michael took paternity leave. 3 months, which was rare back then. He changed diapers, learned to braid hair, came to every pediatrician appointment. We had our second child, David, 3 years later. He was the same present, involved father. We bought the house in Westchester when I was 38, a 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street, Nothing fancy, but ours. We paid our mortgage, went to PTA meetings, took family vacations to Cape Cod, lived the kind of life that wouldn't make anyone's Instagram feed, but felt genuinely good. Michael got promoted 5 years ago. Senior engineer, management track. His salary jumped to 160. Mine had grown too. I'd made senior marketing director at a tech startup, pulling in 120. Combined, we were comfortable. Not rich, but secure. We had a financial advisor, a 401k, a college fund for the kids. The life I'd dreamed about when I was eating ramen on Thursdays. And then, last month, an email showed up in my inbox. It was from the Alumni Association. Our college was having a 15-year reunion. Did I want to attend? I almost deleted it. Reunions felt like torture. A room full of people comparing their salaries and their achievements and their Instagram-perfect families. But Michael said, "Go! It might be fun. You can see what everyone's been up to." He was always encouraging me to do things I was nervous about. That's who he was. I bought a new dress. Nothing extravagant, but nice. Something that made me feel confident. Michael told me I looked beautiful. He kissed me before I left. "Have fun," he said. "You deserve a night out." And that's when I walked into the ballroom and saw Brandon Mueller standing by the bar, looking exactly the same as he had 15 years ago, waiting for his moment to win back the woman he'd never actually lost, because he'd never actually had me. He caught my eye. I watched the recognition hit him, followed immediately by what I can only describe as a predatory smile. He set down his martini and started walking toward me, already composing the narrative in his head. The successful woman who'd gotten away, finally ready to admit that she'd made a mistake leaving him. The security guard at the door must have been a second husband, something she'd settled for. He was going to be the redemption story. He was going to be the one who got the girl in the end. I stood there in my nice dress, with my college diploma and my mortgage and my 2 children and my genuinely happy marriage, watching a man I used to love walk toward me with the confidence of someone who'd never spent a single day questioning his own worth. And then I heard the voice behind me. "There you are. I was wondering where you'd wandered off to." Michael's hand found the small of my back, warm and certain. He'd surprised me. He'd come to the reunion after all, even though I'd told him he didn't have to, that I'd only be gone a couple hours. He was standing beside me in a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, looking more genuinely successful than Brandon had ever managed to look in all his tailored desperation. Brandon stopped. I watched his face process what he was seeing, the hand on my back. The way Michael looked at me, not like I was a prize he'd won, but like I was a person he loved. The way I leaned into him slightly, a gesture so automatic after 15 years that I didn't even realize I was doing it. "Jennifer," Brandon said, recovering quickly. "Good to see you. I wasn't expecting you to bring—" "My husband," Michael said, extending his hand. "Michael, Jennifer's mentioned you before." Brandon shook it, but I could see something flickering behind his eyes. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that this wasn't going to go the way he'd planned. "Let me introduce you to some people," Michael said to me, his hand still on my back. "I want you to meet the Hendersons. They're old friends of mine." We turned to walk away, and I glanced back at Brandon just once. He was still standing by the bar, martini in hand, watching us leave. And I realized something in that moment. He'd spent 15 years believing that I was the one who got away, that I'd wasted my life, that he'd been the great love I'd never gotten over. But the truth was so much simpler. He'd never been my great love. He'd been my rehearsal. Michael was the real thing, and I'd known it from the moment he asked me genuine questions at a birthday party instead of performing his accomplishments for an audience. The reunion continued around us. I danced with my husband. I laughed with old friends. I felt genuinely happy in a way I'd never felt trying to make Brandon's insecurity feel like security. Later that night, after we got home and Michael fell asleep on the couch during a movie, I thought about something he'd said to me once, early in our relationship. We were talking about Brandon, about trust, about whether I'd ever be able to let my guard down completely. He'd told me, "I don't need you to trust me because of who I am. I need you to trust me because of what I do. And what I do is show up. Every single day, I show up." He had. For 15 years, through every doubt and fear and moment when I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, he'd just shown up. And Brandon had shown up to a reunion hoping to find the woman he'd broken, thinking she'd somehow be waiting for him to fix her. He was about to learn that I'd fixed myself, and I'd done it without him. The week after the reunion was strange. Michael and I fell back into our normal routine. He headed to the office early. I managed marketing campaigns from my home desk on Wednesdays and Thursdays. The kids got driven to school. We made dinner together on Thursday nights. Everything was exactly as it had always been. Except I kept thinking about Brandon's face. I shouldn't have let it bother me. I really shouldn't have. But there was something about the way he'd looked at me when Michael's hand landed on my back. Like he'd just realized the script he'd been writing in his head for 15 years had a different ending than he'd imagined. Like the narrative he'd told himself about me pining away for him had suddenly crumbled into dust. It was Friday morning when Ashley called. She'd been at the reunion too, though we'd barely seen each other. She'd been in the bathroom when I arrived, and by the time she found me, Michael was already there. But she'd seen the encounter. Apparently, she'd watched the whole thing from across the room. "Jennifer, honey, I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice had that particular tone she got when she was about to deliver news that was both satisfying and slightly twisted. "What's going on?" "Brandon's been making calls. People from the reunion. He's been asking questions about Michael, about you two, about your marriage." My stomach dropped. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest he doesn't believe your marriage is real. He's been telling people that Michael must be some kind of cover, that you're probably having an affair with someone on the side, that no woman genuinely leaves a guy like him and ends up this happy unless something's seriously wrong with her judgment." I sat down on the kitchen stool, processing this. He's been telling people that? Why would he do that? "Because," Ashley said, and I could almost hear her rolling her eyes through the phone. "Brandon Mueller has spent 15 years building a narrative where you're the one who got away. And now that he's seen you're actually happy, actually married to someone who clearly loves you, his entire worldview is crashing down. So he's trying to rewrite it again. If he can convince enough people that your marriage is fake, or that you're unhappy, then he's not the villain in this story. You are." After we hung up, I told Michael. I expected him to be angry, or amused, or dismissive. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "What do you want to do about it?" "I don't know. Is there anything to do? He's allowed to have opinions about me." "True. But he's not allowed to spread lies about you. And from what Ashley said, that's what he's doing." Michael pulled out his phone and sent a text to someone named David Chen. I didn't know who that was until Michael explained that David had been his roommate in college, had gone to law school, and now ran a small practice focusing on defamation and harassment cases. They met for coffee on Monday. I didn't go. Michael said it was just a consultation, no big deal. But when he came home that evening, he had a folder with him, and he sat down at the kitchen table and walked me through what David had explained. Brandon had indeed been spreading stories. David had already gotten confirmation from 3 separate people who'd been at the reunion and heard Brandon making claims that I was having an affair, that Michael was a cover for something, that I'd probably cheated on Michael already, that it was only a matter of time before my marriage fell apart like everything else in my life apparently did. He'd been precise and strategic about it, never quite saying anything that was provably false, just suggesting possibilities, asking rhetorical questions, planting seeds of doubt in people's minds. "Is it defamation?" I asked Michael. "Technically, no. Not yet. Defamation requires a statement of fact, and Brandon's been careful to stick to opinions and insinuations. But he's crossed into harassment territory, and if he keeps going, if he escalates, there are things we can do about it." "What kind of things?" "Cease and desist letter. Restraining order if necessary. David thinks we should start with the cease and desist, Make it clear that we're aware of what he's doing and that we're documenting it. Sometimes that's enough to make someone stop. I didn't want to escalate things. I really didn't. But over the next 2 weeks, I started hearing reports from other people. A woman from my college sorority reached out to ask if it was true that my marriage was on the rocks. A colleague from an old job sent me a LinkedIn message asking if everything was okay, because someone had apparently told her that I was dealing with serious marital issues. Even my mother called, which never happened, and asked in her awkward way if Michael and I were having problems. Each message felt like a small violation. Brandon wasn't just spreading lies. He was trying to rewrite my reality. He was trying to make other people doubt what I knew to be true. That Michael loved me. That our marriage was solid. That I was genuinely happy. He was trying to make my life match the narrative he'd constructed, where I was the tragic woman who'd made terrible choices. That's when Michael and David sent the cease and desist letter. I didn't see the letter itself. Michael kept that between himself and David. But I could imagine the language. Cease all communications disparaging Jennifer Mitchell. My maiden name was Hartley, but I'd taken Michael's last name when we married. Document all false statements. Be aware that further harassment would result in legal action. The formal language of the law, basically telling Brandon to shut up and leave me alone. For about a week, it worked. No more messages from people at the reunion. No more calls from old friends asking if my marriage was falling apart. It was like someone had finally turned off the noise. Then Brandon did something stupider than anything he'd done before. He sent me a direct message on Facebook. Not a phone call, not an email, a Facebook message, which was timestamped, which was documented, which was saved automatically in both our inboxes. Michael and I were sitting in the living room when my phone buzzed, and I almost didn't look at it, but something made me open it. The message was long. It started with him saying he'd received the cease and desist letter, that he thought it was extreme and unwarranted, and that he wanted to talk to me directly, woman to woman, without lawyers involved. He said that people had a right to speak the truth, and that the truth was, I'd made a terrible mistake leaving him. He said that I was clearly trying to convince everyone, including myself, that I'm happy with some guy I picked up God knows where, and that, one day when this all falls apart, you're going to regret not taking a second chance on someone who actually deserves you. Then he got more aggressive. He said Michael was probably cheating on me. He said I was probably cheating on Michael. He said that people didn't stay married to boring engineers unless there was something fundamentally broken about them. He said I was pathetic for trying to convince myself that stability is the same as love. And then, in the final paragraph, he wrote something that made my blood run cold. I know where you live. I know where your kids go to school. I know where Michael works. I'm not threatening you, but I want you to understand that I'm still watching, and when your marriage falls apart, I'll be waiting. I showed Michael the message without saying anything. He read it once, then twice, his jaw getting tighter with each word. When he finished, he picked up his phone and called David. He sent her a threat, Michael said, his voice perfectly calm. Via Facebook. It's timestamped, it's documented, and it explicitly mentions knowing where our children go to school. We need to file for a restraining order today. The restraining order was filed the next morning. David submitted the cease and desist letter as evidence, along with Brandon's Facebook message, along with the statements from 3 people at the reunion that David had managed to get in writing, documenting the false statements Brandon had made. The court date was set for 2 weeks out. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt like justice was finally happening. Instead, I felt sick. I kept thinking about that last line of his message. I know where your kids go to school. The idea that he'd been looking up information about my family, that he knew where Emma and David spent their days, made my skin crawl. Michael was furious in a way I'd rarely seen. Not at me, but on my behalf. He hired a security consultant to review our home security system. He called the school and made sure they knew that Brandon Muller was not to be allowed to pick up our children under any circumstances. He changed his routine slightly, so he varied the times he left the house and came home. He was careful without being paranoid, protective without being controlling. 2 weeks later, we sat in a courtroom in Westchester County. Brandon was there with an attorney. He'd hired someone to fight the restraining order. His attorney argued that the Facebook message was taken out of context, that Brandon had never made any actual threats, that he was simply trying to re-establish contact with an old flame. He said the restraining order was a gross overreaction by someone who was clearly unstable and using her current husband to wage psychological warfare against her ex. David was methodical. He presented the cease and desist letter. He presented the Facebook message in its entirety. He presented the statements from the 3 reunion attendees. He presented the timeline of Brandon's spreading rumors immediately after seeing me with Michael, then escalating his behavior when the rumors didn't achieve the desired effect. He presented the final message as clear evidence of harassment and stalking behavior. The judge didn't take long to decide. Brandon was issued a temporary restraining order, which would become a permanent restraining order after 30 days, unless he contested it. He was ordered to stay at least 500 yards away from me, Michael, and our children at all times. He was ordered to have no contact with me through any means, phone, email, social media, or otherwise. He was ordered to cease all disparaging comments about me or my family. As the judge read the order, I watched Brandon's face go through several transformations. First, disbelief, then anger, then something that looked almost like shame, but I suspected was actually just embarrassment at being publicly held accountable for his actions. After the hearing, as we were leaving the courthouse, he tried to approach us. Michael stepped between him and me immediately, his hand on my back, and his lawyer, David, moved to intercept Brandon before he could get close. "You've been served," David said calmly. "Any further contact will result in criminal charges. Do you understand?" Brandon's face was red. He looked like he wanted to say something, to fight, to argue his way out of the consequences of his own behavior. But Michael was right there, steady and present, not angry, but absolutely immovable. I'd never loved him more than I did in that moment. In the car on the way home, Michael reached over and squeezed my hand. "It's over," he said. And it was. The restraining order made it real, made it official. Brandon Muller was no longer allowed to be any kind of presence in my life. He couldn't show up at events I attended. He couldn't call me. He couldn't message me. He couldn't even drive past our house. But more than that, the restraining order made something else clear to everyone who'd heard his lies. He was the villain in this story. Not me. Not Michael. Him. His obsession. His inability to accept rejection. His desperate need to rewrite a narrative where he was the hero. All of it was exposed and documented and ruled against by a court of law. I thought about what he'd said at the reunion, about how I'd come crawling back to him within 5 years. I thought about how he'd spent 15 years constructing this fantasy where I was the one who got away, the great love of his life, the woman who'd made a terrible mistake. I thought about how that fantasy had been so important to him that when he saw it was false, when he saw that I was genuinely happy without him, he'd tried to burn down my actual life to make his fantasy true again. The thing about Brandon was that he'd never actually wanted me. He'd wanted the idea of me. He'd wanted the version of me that existed only in his imagination, the version that was incomplete without him, the version that would eventually realize her mistake and come back. He'd wanted to be the hero of my story, but I'd already cast that role. Michael had been the hero all along. Not the showy, dramatic hero of romance novels and fantasy, but the real kind. The kind who showed up every single day. The kind who listened more than he talked. The kind who stood between me and someone who was trying to hurt me without being asked, without hesitation, without needing credit for it. 3 months after the restraining order was issued, I got a text from Ashley. She'd heard through the reunion grapevine that Brandon had moved. His firm had transferred him to their Chicago office. He was leaving New York, leaving the state, leaving the possibility of running into me ever again. I felt a strange sense of closure when I read that message. Not because I was glad he was gone, though I was, but because it meant he'd finally accepted what I'd known for 15 years. I was never coming back. There was no redemption arc for him in my life. There was no ending where he got the girl. There was just the life I'd built with someone who actually deserved me, and the growing distance between me and a man who'd never understood what he'd lost. That evening, Michael and I sat on the porch after the kids went to bed. We didn't talk about Brandon. We just sat there, his arm around me, watching the fireflies blink in the darkness. And I thought about something my therapist had said to me years ago, when I was still dealing with the fallout from Brandon's infidelity. She'd told me that closure isn't something that happens to you. It's something you give yourself by choosing to move forward, by building something real, by refusing to let someone else's narrative become your own. I'd done that. I'd moved forward. I'd built something real. And in the end, that was the most powerful thing I could have possibly done. Not fighting back, though that had been necessary. Not proving him wrong, though the restraining order had done that. Just living well, staying present, showing up for the people I loved, and letting my actual life speak louder than any of his lies ever could. Brandon Muller had wanted to be the hero of my story. Instead, he'd become a footnote, a cautionary tale about what happens when you can't accept that you're not the center of someone else's universe. And I was finally free to write the rest of my story with the man who'd always been there, quietly loving me, asking the right questions, showing up every single day. That was worth so much more than any dramatic reconciliation, any grand gesture, any of the performative love that had characterized my years with Brandon. It was worth everything.